I have to apologize, it's not going to be funny. It's true, though. All right, good evening. Today I'm going to talk to you about a growing trend that might be news to some of you, that carbon offsets are clustering in Central Appalachia, the region in black. And to explain why, I'm going to share with you a story about a small mining community, the Clear Fork Valley, which is in that grainy little black spot. So here on the Kentucky-Tennessee border, the last coal mine shut down last year in 2022. And conditions in this valley, disappearing coal production, high poverty, poor health, and now the concentration of forest carbon offsets illustrate actually broad trends across the Appalachian region. So I conducted a qualitative research study in this community of around 3,000 people from 2020 to 2022. And I asked them what happens to them as the coal industry collapses. Perhaps obviously I found that things got a lot worse. And maybe less intuitively, that the influx of carbon offset investments aren't really helping. And I want to argue that this is actually an issue of environmental justice. So the EPA defines environmental justice as the meaningful involvement of all people affected by environmental regulation in both the decision-making and the implementation of those regulations. And carbon offsets that I'm talking about here today are a form of regulation. So unlike the voluntary offsets that you might buy when you fly an airplane, these are pieces of the mandatory carbon market in California, where big polluters, by law, have to reduce their CO2 emissions or pay someone else to. And they can buy up to 8% of their emissions allowances from sources like carbon offsets. In Central Appalachia, in effect, big California polluters pay timberland owners for better logging practices. And Central Appalachia has now become the third largest concentration of improved forestry management offsets in the United States. And these offsets are clustering where the coal industry has declined and where, as we saw earlier, there's large concentrations of poverty. So anytime scholars of environmental justice, anytime that we see environmental regulation disproportionately affect low-income or marginalized communities, we ask ourselves why. Are communities benefiting from that, or are they bearing the burden of regulation? In Central Appalachia, these offsets cluster here because large corporations own much of the land, and they have for a long time. These are often called absentee corporations. Today, they're basically all financial investor-owned companies. And it's relatively easy for them to install this kind of offset when they control millions of acres of forests. So what I found was that affected communities are not, as the EPA defines, meaningfully involved in the implementation of these projects. Appalachia has become a major site of carbon offset investment, but Appalachians aren't benefiting. Corporate shareholders are. So one example is in the Clear Fork Valley. There, the Nature Conservancy, a large nonprofit, used a for-profit financial firm, NatureVest, to purchase 250,000 acres of land as part of its larger Cumberland Forest project, all of which involved carbon offsets on that land. And I studied what happens to the communities near these projects because of that purchase. So the people you see here at a community center in the valley celebrating a child's birthday, did they benefit? What changed in their lives? Did people lose access to the forest? And I did find that community uses of the forest have been limited. While people have historically had access to the corporate-owned forests to hunt, to dig ginseng, which is very profitable, or collect firewood, there's now a permit and a fee system. But actually, those permits aren't really about the offsets. They're recreational access fees. It's something different. Actually, these offsets are just one piece in a much broader economic trend. New economic activities are bringing virtually no new jobs into this local economy. The result is a hollowed out community. There's no sit-down restaurant in 35 miles. The library closed, the hospital downsized, and now the water utilities on the brink of bankruptcy. For decades, as coal has declined, people have left this place for industrial cities. Now, as one local development practitioner said to me, the coal industry has collapsed, and you'd expect there to be more of an exodus. But people have nowhere else to go. Cities like Knoxville, with unaffordable housing and bad jobs for the working poor, have left rural working class people in what Lauren Berlant calls cramped spaces. seeing few options for themselves or in economic or political futures. And that's stoked what scholars call rural resentment or a political backlash. So people like Randall, pictured here, are fed up, right? He's fed up about drug addiction, poverty, crumbling social services, and none of these are carbon offsets. But when I told him about these new investments, he wasn't surprised. Like, they fit a theme, right? Corporations win while he feels like he loses. And it's important to note that in many ways, Randall's right. Who wins with offsets are corporate shareholders. And even the environmental benefits are dubious. There's growing scientific consensus that forest offsets, as they're currently structured, don't sequester the carbon that they claim to. But they could work better for rural communities and the environment. First, offset regulators could require legally binding community benefits agreements. Second, regulators could increase the conservativeness of offsets and thereby raise the price of carbon. And third, conservative offsets would incentivize more labor-intensive projects. So at the end of the day, forestry offsets that show real sequestration gains are in reforestation, not in improving forestry management. A higher price for carbon and a higher standard, scientific standard for accreditation could put people back to work and help solve climate change. So I'll stop there and say thank you.